At 68 years old, Martha Carter had learned how to disappear without ever leaving the room. She lived in a modest house at the edge of town, the kind of place people walked past without curiosity. The paint had lost its brightness years ago, and the small front gate creaked softly whenever the wind touched it. Inside, everything was clean, orderly, and quiet, as if noise itself had been politely asked to stay away. Every morning, Martha followed the same ritual. She woke before sunrise, not because she had somewhere to go, but because sleep no longer felt like a place of rest. It felt like a doorway to memories she worked hard to keep closed. She made a cup of tea and sat by the window. The window was her connection to a world that no longer expected anything from her. From that spot, she watched children hurry to school, their laughter sharp and careless. She watched couples argue, then make up within minutes. She watched life move forward with confidence, unaware of the weight it would one day carry. No one ever looked back at her window. In the neighborhood, Martha was known as polite, quiet, and simple. She volunteered at the church kitchen once a week, always arriving early and leaving before anyone could ask personal questions. She smiled when spoken to, nodded when thanked, and never stayed long enough for curiosity to grow. People assumed her life had been uneventful. They were wrong. On a small wooden table beside her chair rested an old photograph, carefully placed face down. Had been that way for decades. Not because she hated what it showed, but because some memories demanded more strength than she had each day. Martha believed in discipline, in control, in silence. Silence had protected her when nothing else could. Every evening, just before drawing the curtains shut, she whispered the same sentence, a sentence worn smooth by 40 years of repetition. I did what I had to do. She never asked if it had been right, only if it had been necessary. There were moments, especially at night, when laughter from nearby houses drifted through her open window. On those nights, Martha pressed her palm lightly against the glass, not in longing, but in acknowledgement, as if greeting a life she once imagined, then quietly released. The world believed Martha had lived carefully. In truth, she had lived bravely. What no one knew was that her silence wasn't emptiness. It was storage. A place where love, regret, sacrifice, and an unspeakable decision had been locked away for over 40 years. And Martha truly believed that the past, once buried deep enough, stayed buried. She did not yet know that on this ordinary morning, something was already making its way toward her door, something that would force every locked memory to open. The sound was small, almost unnoticeable. A soft scrape as the mail slipped through the narrow slot in Martha's front door. She froze. It was strange how a sound so ordinary could feel so heavy. For a moment she didn't move. The house returned to silence, but something in her chest tightened, as if it recognized a disturbance before her mind did. Martha stood slowly and walked toward the door. At her feet lay a thin stack of envelopes, bills, advertisements, things meant to be dealt with and forgotten. But one envelope was different. It was thicker, heavier, cream-colored, with edges too clean for everyday mail. The handwriting on the front was careful and deliberate, the kind used for announcements, not necessities. She almost left it there. In her 68 years, Martha had learned that unexpected things rarely arrived with good intentions. So she gathered the rest of the mail first, stacking them neatly, delaying the inevitable. When she finally picked up the cream envelope, her hands trembled. The name written on it stopped her breath. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was painfully familiar. A name she had spent 4 decades training herself not to speak out loud. Her heart began to pound, slow at first, then urgent. She carried the envelope to the table and sat down, as if her legs had suddenly forgotten their purpose. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she traced the letters with her fingertip, memories rising uninvited. Faces, voices, a time when her future still felt open. When she finally broke the seal, the paper inside unfolded like a quiet announcement of fate. It was a wedding invitation. Elegant, formal, impossible. Her eyes moved over the details, the date, the venue, the family names, until they reached the line that made her vision blur. The groom's name. Martha's breath caught in her throat. No, she thought. This can't be real. She read it again. And again. There was no mistake. The past she had buried, protected, sacrificed for, had not disappeared. Had grown. It had lived a full life without her. And now, it was inviting her to witness a moment she never believed she would see. Her chest tightened, and she pressed her hand against it, steadying herself. Questions flooded her mind. How did they find me? Why now? What do they expect from me? But beneath the fear lived something far more dangerous, hope. A hope she had sworn never to entertain. Martha folded the invitation carefully and placed it on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge. Control even now mattered. That night she did not sit by the window. She sat on the edge of her bed, holding the invitation in her hands like a fragile truth. Tears came quietly, not in waves but in single drops, each one carrying the weight of years she could never get back. For the first time in 40 years, Martha whispered a different sentence into the dark. What if I was wrong? And with that question, everything she believed about her past and her future began to change. There was a time when Martha's name was spoken with laughter. Before silence became her armor, before routine became her refuge, there had been a young woman who believed love was enough to shape a future. She had been 26 when she met him. It happened in an ordinary way, the kind of meeting no one would remember except the two people it changed forever. He had smiled first. Not confidently but kindly. The kind of smile that made a person feel seen rather than impressed. They talked for hours that day. About small dreams. About big fears. About the lives they thought they might live. With him, Martha felt safe to imagine. Their love grew quietly, carefully, hidden from the sharp eyes of judgment. They met in borrowed moments, in places where no one asked questions. And in those moments the world felt softer. But love does not exist in isolation. Reality found them the way it always does. His family had expectations. Her family had warnings. Whispers became conversations. Conversations became pressure. And pressure became certainty. This cannot continue. They were told their love was inconvenient, that it would bring shame, that it would cost more than it was worth. Martha was asked to be reasonable, to think long-term, to consider consequences. He wanted to fight. He spoke of running away, of starting over somewhere no one knew their names. He promised her a life built from courage rather than permission. Martha wanted to believe him. But belief does not erase fear. When she discovered she was pregnant, everything changed. The news arrived quietly. No celebration, no joy. Only a cold understanding that time had run out. Love was no longer just a feeling. It was a responsibility. Fear surrounded her from every side. Voices grew louder. Decisions were made without her presence. Futures were discussed as if she were not the one who would have to live them. She was told the child would destroy them both. She was told love was not enough. She was told to choose. That night, Martha sat alone in her room, holding her hands against her stomach, whispering apologies to a life not yet born. She cried not for herself, but for the future she could now see slipping away. By morning the choice had been made. Not because she stopped loving him, but because loving him meant protecting what grew inside her, even if it meant breaking her own heart. She ended things without explanation. She walked away while he was still looking for answers. And from that moment on, love became something she remembered, not something she allowed herself to feel again. Martha gave birth on a rainy morning. The kind of rain that fell steadily, without drama, as if the sky itself understood this was not a moment for noise. The room was small and white and unfamiliar. No family waited outside. No hands reached for hers in comfort. She had asked for it that way. Fewer witnesses meant fewer questions. Fewer questions meant less pain she would have to explain. When the baby cried, Martha closed her eyes. Not because she didn't want to hear it, but because she was afraid that if she saw the child for too long, she would never survive what came next. They placed the baby in her arms briefly. So briefly it felt cruel. The child was warm and impossibly light. A tiny hand curled around her finger with an instinct older than reason. In that moment, the world narrowed to the rhythm of a heartbeat. Hers and the baby's tangled together. Martha whispered a name. Not the name written on any document. A name meant only for her. She memorized the child's face the way someone memorizes a prayer, desperately, knowing it would be needed later. Then the nurse returned. And just like that, the moment ended. The baby was carried away, wrapped in a blanket too large for such a small life. Martha watched the door close, feeling something inside her fracture quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change the shape of everything that followed. She did not scream. She did not beg. She lay there in silence, staring at the ceiling, repeating the only thought that made survival possible. This is love. This is protection. The papers were signed before she had time to doubt herself. Hands guided her through the process gently, as if kindness could soften the truth. They told her the child would have a better life. More opportunity. Less shame. Martha nodded. Agreement was easier than collapse. She left the hospital empty-armed and heavy-hearted. Every step felt like walking away from a part of herself. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the world had resumed its rhythm. People talking, cars passing, life continuing as if nothing irreversible had just occurred. From that day forward, time became a quiet test of endurance. Every year on the same date, Martha woke with a familiar ache. She imagined birthdays, first steps, school days. She wondered whose eyes the child had inherited, whose laugh. She never searched. Not because she didn't want to, but because she believed distance was the final act of protection. She carried the secret like a second spine, invisible but essential to how she stood in the world. And every night, when silence returned, Martha whispered the same promise into the dark. I gave you away so you could live. After the hospital, Martha learned how to live without being asked questions. She returned to a world that expected her to continue, to work, to smile politely, to exist without explanation. And she did exactly that. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She never told anyone what she had done. Not her parents. Not her friends. Not the man she loved. Silence became her shield. She poured herself into work, taking extra hours, accepting responsibilities without complaint. Being busy meant being protected. People respect productivity. They rarely question it. When friends spoke about marriage, Martha smiled and changed the subject. When relatives hinted at children, she laughed softly and said life had taken a different path. No one pressed her. Society is comfortable with quiet women. Years passed. She watched others build families while she built endurance. She attended weddings with practiced grace, congratulating couples while reminding herself that joy did not always arrive in the same shape for everyone. At night, when the house was still, the truth returned. She imagined what her child might be doing at that age. Learning to walk, to read, to ride a bicycle. She marked milestones privately, counting time in what-ifs rather than years. Martha learned to love from a distance. She sent kindness into the world where she could. She volunteered. She listened. She became the woman others leaned on during hard moments, perhaps because she understood pain without needing it explained. People admired her strength. They never knew its cost. There were times she wanted to speak, to tell someone the truth just once, to hear it exist outside her own mind. But fear always answered first. Fear of judgment. Fear of misunderstanding. Fear of reopening a wound she had worked so hard to survive. So she stayed silent. And silence demanded sacrifice. She never married, not because she didn't want love, but because she feared what love might ask of her. She believed she had already given everything she had. As her hair turned gray and her steps slowed, Martha told herself she had made peace. But peace, she would later learn, is not the same as healing. Still she carried on. With dignity. With kindness. With a quiet bravery no one applauded. And through every year of silence, one truth remained unshaken. She had not given her child away because she lacked love. She had done it because love, sometimes, asks us to disappear so someone else can live fully. And for 40 years, Martha paid that price without ever asking to be understood. For 3 weeks, the invitation remained exactly where Martha had placed it. Entered. Freight. Touch. Every morning she noticed it. Every night she avoided looking at it for too long. It became part of the room, like a quiet question no one wanted to answer. Some days she told herself she wouldn't go. What place did she have in that world? In that moment, she imagined arriving only to be met with confusion, suspicion, or worse, silence. She imagined faces turning away, doors closing politely but firmly. She had lived her entire life preparing for absence. Why risk humiliation now? Other days she told herself she must go. Because this wasn't curiosity. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something deeper, something unfinished. The past was no longer knocking. It was standing inside her home, waiting. At night, sleep abandoned her completely. She lay awake replaying moments she had buried carefully for decades. The hospital room. The signature on the paper. The weight of a baby she never got to know. She wondered if attending the wedding would undo the fragile peace she had built, or finally complete it. Fear whispered loudly. You will be rejected. You will be blamed. You will be told you waited too long. But beneath the fear was a quieter voice. One she had ignored for 40 years. What if this is the only chance? Martha stood in front of her mirror one evening and barely recognized the woman staring back. The lines on her face told a story of endurance, not weakness. Of survival, not failure. She realized something then, something unexpected. She was no longer afraid of being hurt. She had already survived the worst pain of her life. What she feared now was regret. The regret of silence. The regret of never showing up. The regret of leaving the truth unsaid one last time. The morning she made her decision, Martha folded the invitation and placed it carefully into her handbag. Not dramatically, not triumphantly, simply, deliberately. She didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. She chose a modest dress from her closet, smoothing the fabric with slow, thoughtful hands. She packed it carefully, as if preparing for a journey much longer than a single day. As she locked her front door, she paused. For the first time in years, her house felt temporary. Martha didn't know what awaited her at the wedding. She didn't expect forgiveness. She didn't expect acceptance. She didn't even expect understanding. What she expected was truth. And for the first time since the day she walked out of that hospital empty-handed, Martha chose courage over silence. She stepped forward, not to reclaim the past, but to finally face it. The wedding hall rose before Martha like a different world. Tall glass doors reflected chandeliers that glowed warmly inside, spilling light onto the marble steps. Soft music drifted through the air, violins and laughter woven together. Guests arrived in polished cars, dressed in colors that shimmered with confidence. Martha stood at the edge of it all, her small handbag held tightly in both hands. For a moment she considered turning back. Inside those doors lived a life she had never known, one filled with abundance, celebration, and certainty. It was the kind of world she had once believed she had protected her child for. Even if it meant she would never belong to it herself. She took a breath and stepped inside. The air was warm, scented with flowers and perfume. Everywhere she looked, there were smiles. Bright, effortless smiles. People embraced, laughed loudly, spoke of vacations and futures without hesitation. No one noticed her arrival. And that hurt more than she expected. She moved slowly, careful not to interrupt conversations. Her shoes made almost no sound against the polished floor. Waiters passed by with silver trays, never meeting her eyes. She felt like a shadow drifting through a celebration. Martha found a seat near the back. From there she observed quietly, as she always had. She watched the bride glide across the room, radiant and certain. She watched the groom greet guests with confidence, a confidence that felt strangely familiar. Her heart tightened, not with jealousy, but with recognition. So this is the life you were given, she thought. The decorations were rich. gold accents, soft candlelight, flowers arranged with precision. Everything spoke of care, planning, and love. Everything she had once hoped for, from a distance. Around her, guests spoke of family history, of shared memories stretching back generations. Names were mentioned that Martha did not recognize. And yet, somehow, she knew she belonged to them in a way no one else in the room understood. She kept her gaze lowered when people passed, afraid that one glance might invite questions she wasn't ready to answer. Her presence was unnoticed, but her heart was loud. As the ceremony began, Martha's hands trembled slightly in her lap. She folded them together, steadying herself. She reminded herself why she was there. Not to be seen, not to be acknowledged, but to witness. This was never about reclaiming a place. It was about honoring a life. As the music swelled and guests rose to their feet, Martha remained seated for a brief moment longer. She whispered softly, a habit formed long ago. Be brave. She stood. In a room filled with celebration, Martha Carter felt smaller than ever. And yet, beneath that smallness, something unshakable had taken root. She was exactly where she was meant to be, even if no one else knew it yet. The room was filled with music when it happened. A gentle melody floated through the hall as glasses clinked and quiet laughter rippled between tables. The ceremony had ended, and the celebration had begun, exactly as planned. Perfect, polished, untouched by the weight of hidden truths. Martha sat still in her chair, hands folded, heart pounding. She had told herself she would leave early, slip out unnoticed, carry the sight of this happiness home with her, and return to silence. That was the plan. But truth rarely respects plans. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone lightly, smiling as the room gradually hushed. He began to speak about family, about roots, legacy, and the people who shape us long before we are aware of it. Martha felt a tightening in her chest. Then a name was spoken. Name. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly enough to cut through the air. Martha Carter. The room shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Chairs creaked as heads turned. The sound of celebration drained away, leaving behind a thick, uncomfortable quiet. Martha's breath caught. She had imagined this moment in 100 ways. Anger, rejection, disbelief. But she had never imagined the stillness. The way the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The groom looked confused at first. His smile faded slowly as he searched the crowd, trying to understand why this name mattered. His eyes landed on Martha. Time slowed. Recognition flickered across his face. Not memory but instinct. A strange pull he had never questioned suddenly demanded attention. Someone whispered. Someone else stood. The bride reached for the groom's hand, sensing the shift before understanding it. Martha stood up. Her legs trembled, but her voice, when it came, was steady. I wasn't meant to speak, she said quietly. I only came to see that you were happy. The room remained frozen. She took one step forward, then another. 40 years of silence pressed against her chest, begging to be released. I am not here to take anything away, she continued. I am here because the truth has lived in me for a lifetime, and it deserves air. Gasps rippled through the room. The groom's face had gone pale. His eyes never left hers. Martha swallowed hard. I am your mother. The words landed softly, but their impact was thunderous. A glass shattered somewhere. A chair scraped loudly against the floor. The bride's hand flew to her mouth. For a moment no one moved. Then emotion surged. Questions burst out. Tears followed. Shock gave way to something deeper, something raw. Martha stood there, exposed and unprotected, waiting for judgment. But what came instead was silence. And a single step forward. The groom walked toward her, slowly, uncertainly, as if approaching a truth he had unknowingly waited his entire life to meet. And in that moment, the celebration transformed into something far more powerful than joy. It became truth. No one spoke at first. The music had stopped. The laughter was gone. Even the chandeliers seemed dimmer, as if the room itself understood this was no longer a celebration. It was a reckoning. The groom stood a few steps away from Martha, his face pale, his eyes filled with questions he didn't yet know how to ask. His hands trembled at his sides. "I don't understand," he finally whispered. Martha nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I didn't expect you to." Her voice carried no defense, no justification, only truth. She told him everything, not quickly, not dramatically, but carefully, as if each word needed permission to exist. She spoke of fear, of pressure, of a world that demanded choices no woman should ever have to make. She spoke of the hospital room, the rain, the moment she held him for the first and only time. Tears slid down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She had hidden long enough. The room listened in stunned silence. Even those who wanted to look away couldn't. This wasn't gossip. This was history breathing. The groom's mother, the woman who had raised him, stood up. Her eyes were wet. "I always knew," she said softly, "that there was more to his story." She walked toward Martha, placing a hand on her arm. "You didn't abandon him," she said. "You protected him." Martha's knees nearly gave way. The groom looked between the two women who had shaped his life without ever meeting. Then he stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as if afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too fast. "Why now?" he asked. Martha met his eyes. "Because I wanted you to know," she said, "that you were loved before you were born, and never forgotten after." The words broke something open inside him. His breath caught, his shoulders shook, and then, without thinking, he reached for her. The embrace was awkward at first, two strangers unsure of where they belonged. Then it wasn't. Martha felt his arms tighten around her, felt his heartbeat against her chest. The same rhythm she had memorized decades ago. She closed her eyes. For the first time since that rainy morning, her arms were no longer empty. Around them people cried openly. The bride wiped tears from her face, then smiled through them. Guests who had arrived for a wedding now witnessed something far rarer: forgiveness. The groom pulled back slightly and looked at Martha. "You didn't ruin my life," he said. "You gave me one." Martha had no words. She only nodded. Some wounds don't disappear, but some finally heal. And in that room, filled with tears and trembling hearts, love found its way back home. Martha did not stay long after the celebration resumed. Not because she wasn't welcome, but because her heart had already received more than it could carry. She stepped outside the wedding hall quietly, the night air cool against her face. The lights behind her glowed warmly, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was leaving something behind. She felt complete. For 40 years, Martha had lived with a single belief: that silence was the price of love, that sacrifice required disappearance, that some choices could only be survived, not healed. She had been wrong. In the days that followed, life did not suddenly become perfect. There were conversations still waiting to happen, memories still painful to touch. But something fundamental had shifted. The weight she carried was lighter. The house that once felt permanent now felt open. Martha found herself sleeping through the night for the first time in decades. Dreams still came, but they no longer hurt. They felt like visitors rather than intruders. She received a letter one morning. This time it wasn't formal. It was handwritten. Her son thanked her, not for the decision itself, but for the courage to finally tell the truth. He wrote that knowing where he came from didn't weaken him. It strengthened him. That her love, though delayed, had arrived exactly when it was needed. Martha held the letter against her chest and wept. Not from sorrow, from peace. She began attending family gatherings quietly, never demanding a title, never claiming a role. She understood that love does not always need labels to exist. And yet, in the smallest gestures, a glance, a shared smile, a familiar laugh, she felt something she had never allowed herself to expect: belonging. Martha learned that it is never too late to speak the truth. That time does not erase love. It only tests its endurance. and that some of the bravest acts happen not in youth, but in the final chapters of life. To anyone listening to her story, Martha's life offers a gentle reminder. You are not weak for surviving. You are not late for telling your truth. And you are never wrong for choosing love, even when it costs you everything. Because sometimes the peace we spend a lifetime searching for arrives the moment we stop hiding.